In chapter 16, we're talking about direction. And I think this can be a bit of a mind bender. It's easy to get confused about a lot of this. That's because the spiritual environment works in a very different way from the natural one. In the spiritual world, our external experience is determined by our inner life through correspondence, whereas we're used to a natural experience, which is to a greater extent independent from our mental and spiritual landscape. Notice Swedenborg writes that our world is oriented by the south. He writes, "In the world, the south is said to be where the sun is in its greatest altitude above the earth. Thus, in the world, it is from the south that all the quarters are determined." Now, of course, he's talking about the equator and doing so from the perspective of someone living in the northern hemisphere. In modern cartography, we orient our maps to the north. So when you look at any map, it's always printed with the north at the top. However, many religious traditions shift that focus to the east. So, for example, traditionally, Christian churches were built facing east. And in the Bible, the directions are spoken of as though facing east. So, south is to the right, north is to the left, and the west behind. But notice our language too. Finding my orientation means to get my bearings, find my location and my direction. And we mean that both externally, in space, in the physical world, and internally, in my mental and spiritual landscape. But it is the East that we call the Orient. Swedenborg goes further than this though. I wonder whether you noticed in paragraph 142. The entire heaven turns to the Lord as to its common centre. Thus all the angels turn to him. It is known that also on the earth there is a directing of all things towards a common centre. In heaven the front parts are turned to their common centre, but in the world the lower parts. In the world this directing is called centripetal force and also gravitation. So if I read that right, direction in heaven has more in common with gravity than it does with the four quarters of the earth. And if you've ever read the children's novel Ender's Game, the hero learns the necessity of gravity for finding our orientation, giving us a sense of up and down, and he learns to use that knowledge to outwit and defeat his opponents. Again, here we read about people in the hells looking in the opposite direction to the angels. Those in the hells, he writes, do not look to the Lord as a son, but they look backwards away from the Lord to that dense blackness that is the place of the Son of the world. But notice this, he doesn't say west. To them, the east is where that dense blackness and darkness are. The west is where the Son of Heaven is. The south is to their right, and the north to their left, and this also in every turning of their bodies. This reminds me of an important idea in Swedenborg's work. Every correspondence has two sides, good and evil, and whether we understand it as representing good or evil depends upon the context and the perspective we view it from. For example, we think of death as bad, but Swedenborg writes, "The angels know nothing of death, nor of sickness, and therefore have no idea of them. But in their place, when man reads of them, They have the idea of the continuation of life and of resurrection. So death in the Bible might mean the death of the body leading to eternal life. Or it might mean the death of the body leading to the death of the soul, spiritual death, which is evil, ruled by love of self and love of the world. It's referred to in the book of Revelation as the second death. And in the parable of the rich fool, the story of a man who tore down his barns so that he could build bigger ones to store his wealth, Jesus said, "Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided?" Now, if all of this puts your head in a spin, you're not alone. I find it quite disorienting, but maybe that's the point. The thing to remember is that your orientation in heaven is determined by your own inner nature, rather than by your relationship with things external to yourself. It's the principles that govern your life which determine your direction. Back in the notes to chapter 7, we explored Swedenborg's concept of the ruling love. As always, you're welcome to read along with us or read ahead if you prefer. You may have questions you'd like to share with us in the comments below. Enjoy the journey.